Morning came slowly to Nuridu Valley. The first pale light of dawn slipped over the distant ridges of the Valeward Mountains and crept quietly down into the basin where the village rested beside the Lantern River. Long shadows stretched across the fields while thin threads of mist drifted between the orchard rows and the grazing pastures beyond the village fence. Inside the hunter's longhouse, the light arrived more gently. Sunlight filtered through narrow wooden shutters, carved with simple geometric patterns, triangles, waves, and spirals that the village craftsmen had etched into the wood generations ago. The shapes scattered thin bands of gold across the packed earth floor and the long rows of straw bedding laid along the walls. The longhouse itself was sturdy but humble. Heavy cedar beams supported the roof overhead, darkened by decades of hearth smoke. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters, tied with thin cords of braided flax. The smell of sage, thyme, and wood smoke lingered in the warm air. Along the western wall, the boys slept. Along the eastern wall, the girls slept. Between them stretched a wide aisle where boots, blankets, and weapons tended to gather in a kind of organized chaos by morning. This arrangement had never changed. The Lantern Ten had never lived in separate homes. They never had. The Magus believed hunters survived longer when they lived like a single pack. So they slept together. A hunter who woke alone, he often said, was a hunter who might not wake again. At the far end of the longhouse, the hearth still glowed faintly from the previous night's fire. Embers crackled softly beneath a hanging iron kettle that had boiled water for the morning wash. Enkidu woke slowly to the quiet sounds of breathing, shifting blankets, and the faint pop of settling firewood. For a moment, he simply stared at the wooden beams above him. Even after weeks in the valley, the life here still felt strange, familiar, but strange. Memories from another life drifted through the edges of his thoughts like fading dreams. Apartments, electric lights, noise. None of it belonged here. None of it mattered anymore. Nova hovered quietly beside him, her faint blue form glowing softly in the early morning light. She floated just above the ground near his bedroll, observing the room with the calm curiosity she often showed when studying human behavior. "Your companions share a communal living structure," she observed softly. Enkidu rubbed his eyes. "Yeah." Across the room, Kale snored loudly. Nova tilted her head slightly as if analyzing the sound. "That noise appears irregular." Enkidu smirked. "That's Kyle." As if summoned by insult, Kyle rolled onto his back and cracked one eye open. "I heard that." From the other side of the hall, Celine's voice followed instantly. "Then stop snoring." Cal pulled his blanket over his head. Unfair. The longhouse slowly began to stir. Rethan was already awake near the doorway, crouched over the packed earth floor, where he had scratched a series of animal tracks into the dirt with the tip of a knife. The scout studied them quietly, occasionally erasing a line and redrawing it with careful precision. Beside him, Soren sat cross-legged, sharpening one of his daggers on a whetstone. The steady rasp of steel against stone cut gently through the quiet room. Near the weapon rack, Thalin and Doggin stretched their shoulders and arms, warming stiff muscles from yesterday's fight. The two tanks moved with slow, deliberate motions, testing their balance the way seasoned fighters often did before a long day of training. Across the hall, Liara braided Mira's hair, while Celine tied her own back into a tight knot. They had clearly done this routine many times before. Mira winced slightly as Liara pulled a stubborn knot loose. "You're doing that on purpose." Liara smiled sweetly. "If I were doing it on purpose, you'd know." Celine glanced over. "She's right." Mira sighed dramatically. "Traitors everywhere." Enkidu pushed himself upright and stretched his arms above his head. Nova drifted slowly toward the others, studying the group with quiet fascination. They function with strong coordination, she said. That's because they grew up together, Enkidu replied quietly. Celine glanced across the room. Talking to Nova again? Enkidu shrugged. She thinks you're organized. Celine smirked. She's right. From beneath his blanket, Kale's voice emerged. She's wrong. Without warning, a boot flew across the room and struck the blanket covering Kale's head. Get up, Celine said. Cal groaned dramatically. Violence. Breakfast. Kyle instantly sat upright. Oh! That single word carried enough enthusiasm to make half the room laugh. Boots were pulled on. Blankets rolled. Weapons lifted from the rack for inspection. Rethan wiped away his practice tracks with one sweep of his hand and stood. Soren slid his dagger back into its sheath. Thalon lifted his shield and tested the grip strap. Doggin cracked her neck once. Liara finished Mira's braid. Celine stepped toward the door and pushed it open. Cool morning air rushed into the longhouse, carrying the scent of river water and fresh bread drifting from the dining hall beside the Magus' tower. Kyle sniffed the air. Bread. Kesh stood and stretched. You'd smell that in a storm. Kyle nodded proudly. It's a gift. Celine stepped outside. Move. The Lantern 10 followed her out into the rising light of Nuridu Valley. Breakfast was waiting. Outside the hall, the cool morning air greeted them. A long stone trough carried clear water from the Lantern River. Cal splashed his face and recoiled immediately. That water is cold. Rathan pushed him aside calmly. Move. Soren washed his hands and shook his head. You complain every morning. I narrate hardship, Kyle replied. Doggin folded her arms. You complain. Cal thought about this for a moment. Both can be true. Laughter spread through the group as the familiar routine of morning preparation continued. The dining hall stood across the packed courtyard from the hunter's longhouse, its wide doors already open to the morning air. Warm light spilled from inside. So did the smell of fresh bread. Cal stopped walking. Bread. Soren kept moving. Yes, good bread. Bread always smells good. Kyle nodded seriously. That's because bread is good. Celine didn't slow as she stepped through the doorway. If you stare at it long enough, it won't get closer. Kyle immediately resumed walking. Inside, the hall was already alive with the quiet rhythm of morning. Long wooden tables stretched across the room beneath thick roof beams, darkened by years of hearth smoke. Villagers filled the benches in small groups, farmers eating before heading to the fields, hunters preparing for patrols, elders speaking softly over clay cups of hot tea. At the far end of the hall, a massive stone hearth glowed with steady flame. 3 women moved around it with practiced speed, flipping flatbread across iron pans while stirring large pots of steaming grain and vegetables. The Lantern 10 moved toward their usual place near the center of the hall. Not by rule, simply because no one else wanted to compete with 10 growing warriors at breakfast. Cal reached the table first and dropped into the bench with relief. A wooden bowl slid in front of him. He leaned forward and inspected it. Porridge again. Liara sat across from him. You like porridge. I like bread. There's bread. Cal tore off a large piece immediately. Perfect. Enkidu sat beside Celine near the end of the table, while Nova hovered quietly near his shoulder, her faint blue glow barely noticeable in the morning light. She studied the room with interest. Your people gather here each morning for nourishment and social interaction, she observed quietly. Enkidu took a bite of bread. It's called breakfast. Nova tilted her head slightly. A highly efficient system. Across the table, Mira leaned towards Selene. Did anyone else sleep badly? Kesh nodded while chewing. Kyle snores. Kyle pointed his spoon. That is an unverified accusation. Soren spoke without looking up. It is verified. Several people nodded. Kyle frowned. Traitors! Dagon laughed. You could wake the forest with that noise. Good, Kale replied proudly. Then monsters know I'm coming. Rethan glanced up. They'd hear you and leave. That's strategy. Celine shook her head while eating. That's noise. More bowls arrived as the kitchen women moved through the hall delivering food. Stewed vegetables, fresh bread, thick porridge sweetened lightly with honey. The Lantern 10 ate like hunters, which meant efficiently. Conversation flowed easily between them. Liara leaned toward Mira again. I had a strange dream. Mira raised an eyebrow. You always have strange dreams. This time the trees were whispering. That part is new. Thalin looked up from his bowl. What did they say? Liara shrugged. I woke up before they finished. Kyle pointed at her with a piece of bread. They were probably complaining about your cooking. Liara smiled slowly. Careful. Kyle paused. Why? Because I'm the one who heals you. Kyle swallowed. I withdraw my statement. Soren muttered quietly. Wise. At the end of the table, Enkidu watched them quietly. Even after only a short time with them, he could already see the patterns of the group. Celine held the center. The others moved naturally around her calm confidence. The scouts watched everything. The tanks anchored the group like stone. Liara balanced the group's mood. Mira felt everything deeply but hid it behind humor. Kale created chaos. Kesh supported that chaos. Nova spoke softly beside him. You are analyzing their behavior, trying to understand them. They accept you. Enkidu nodded. Yeah. Across the table, Selene noticed him watching. What? Nothing. You were staring. I was observing. Selene smirked. That's worse. Kesh leaned forward slightly. Is this another one of your Nova conversations? Enkidu shrugged. Maybe. Kesh narrowed his eyes. Does she ever insult us? Nova paused thoughtfully. Occasionally. Enkidu grinned. She says Kale snores. The entire table burst into laughter. Kale raised both hands. Slander! Celine wiped tears from her eyes. No. She pointed at him. That's truth. Before Kale could argue, the large doors of the hall opened. Conversations throughout the room quieted slightly. The Magus entered. He walked calmly across the hall with the quiet authority of someone who needed no introduction. His long silver hair rested across dark blue robes tied loosely at the waist with braided cord. Though old, his posture remained strong, his eyes sharp beneath thick brows. He approached the Lantern 10's table and stopped beside Celine. For a moment, he simply watched them eat. Then he nodded once. Good. Kyle froze mid-bite. Celine sat straighter. Rethan lowered his spoon. The Magus spoke calmly. You eat well. Kesh nodded. We try. The old man rested one hand lightly on the table. Finish your meal. He paused briefly. Then meet me at the training grounds. The group exchanged quick glances. Cal raised a hand. Training today? The Magus looked at him. You have grown stronger. Celine spoke quietly. Level 2. The Magus nodded once. Yes. Dagon leaned forward slightly. You want to test it? The old man smiled faintly. I already have. Soren asked quietly. How? The Magus looked around the table. I observe. He straightened slightly. Eat. Then he added calmly. Your new strength deserves to be understood before you carry it into the forest. That sentence changed the mood at the table. Celine's eyes sharpened. Forest? The Magus did not answer directly. Instead, he simply said, Training grounds. Then he turned and walked toward the door. The hall slowly returned to its morning rhythm. For a moment, the Lantern Ten sat quietly. Then Kale grabbed another piece of bread. Well, he stood. Let's go break something. Celine stood as well. Finish eating first. Kyle sat back down. Fine. The training grounds lay just beyond the village wall, where the packed earth flattened into a wide-open field of worn soil and scattered practice targets. The Lantern Ten had trained there since they were small children. It was where they had first learned to hold a blade, where bruises had turned into skill, where the Magus had watched them grow. Morning sunlight spilled across the open field as they approached. Wooden weapon racks lined the outer edge of the grounds, holding staffs, practice swords, shields, and training spears worn smooth by years of use. The Magus already stood near the center of the field. He had arrived before them. Of course he had. His hands were folded calmly behind his back as the Lantern Ten spread across the ground, each instinctively moving toward their familiar positions. Celine stepped forward. What are we testing today? The Magus studied them carefully before answering. Strength. Kyle cracked his neck. Good. The Magus nodded toward the racks. Training weapons. Several of the group exchanged small smiles. They had expected that. Even after gaining their levels, tradition remained tradition. Practice first. Always. The scouts moved first. Soren and Rethen each lifted light wooden blades, testing their balance with quick flicks of the wrist. Kel and Kesh grabbed heavier training swords while Thalin and Dagan lifted wooden shields that had been patched more times than anyone could count. Lyra and Mira stepped back slightly as Selene selected a wooden spear from the rack and spun it once in her hands. Enkidu took a training sword. It felt familiar. Too familiar. Nova drifted beside him quietly. You are anticipating failure. He frowned slightly. I'm anticipating Kale breaking something. Across the field, Kale grinned. Let's see what level 2 actually means. Selene pointed her spear. Pairs. They moved immediately, not like soldiers, more like a pack of wolves who had fought beside one another their entire lives. Soren faced Rathan. Scout against scout, speed against speed. Thalin faced Dagan, two walls of muscle testing shields and balance. Liara and Mira moved to practice staff forms together. Kyle grinned at Kesh. You ready? Kesh lifted his sword. Always. Selene stepped toward Enkidu. Ready? He nodded. Ready. The Magus stepped back slightly. Begin. The field exploded into motion. Wood cracked against wood as blades met. Shields slammed. Boots dug into the earth as fighters shifted and moved. Selene moved first. Her spear flicked forward with startling speed, the wooden shaft striking Enkidu's blade with a sharp crack. He barely caught it. She smiled. You're slower this morning. He lunged. Their weapons collided again. Across the field, Kyle swung heavily at Kesh. The blow landed with a loud crack. The wooden blade shattered in half. Both men froze. They stared at the broken weapon. Then Kale blinked. That's new. Before anyone could react, another crack echoed across the field. Soren's training dagger snapped cleanly at the hilt as he parried Rethan's strike. Thalin shoved forward with his shield, and the wooden reinforcement across its center split loudly. Pieces fell into the dirt. For a moment, the entire field went still. Everyone looked down at their weapons. Selene slowly lowered her spear. The shaft had split along its grain from the force of her last strike. Liara lifted her staff. A fracture ran halfway down its length. Kale held up his broken sword. Well, the Magus smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was genuine. He walked slowly across the field, studying the broken training gear scattered across the ground. Good, Kyle blinked. Good? The old man nodded. You have grown. He turned toward the storage shed beside the training grounds. For weeks, I wondered when this would happen. Celine crossed her arms. You expected it? Yes. The Magus walked to the heavy wooden doors of the shed and pushed them open. The Lantern 10 followed. Inside, the morning light revealed something none of them had expected. Weapons, rows of them. Armor hung carefully along wooden racks. Blades rested across tables, helmets lined shelves. Everything gleamed faintly in the dim light. The metal was unlike anything they had seen before. It was darker than bronze, yet it shimmered faintly with hints of deep blue and silver beneath the surface. Celine stepped forward slowly. What is this? The Magus walked past them into the room. Your next step. Cal lifted a sword carefully from the nearest rack. The blade felt perfectly balanced, stronger, lighter. What metal is this? The Magus answered simply. Better metal. Kesh tested the edge with his thumb. This could cut stone. The old man smiled faintly. Let us hope you do not try. He walked to the armor rack. These were made for each of you. Celine's armor hung at the center. Light scale plates layered across flexible leather, designed for movement rather than brute defense. The metal scales shimmered faintly like dark water beneath sunlight. Her spear rested beside it. Not wood. The shaft was crafted from deep black ash wood, reinforced with narrow bands of the strange metal. The spearhead itself gleamed like moonlight. Celine lifted it carefully. It's perfect. The Magus nodded. It should be. Next to it hung Enkidu's gear, a balanced cuirass of layered metal plates shaped to allow speed and movement. His primary weapon rested beneath it. A long sword. The blade curved slightly, its edge sharp and bright. Beside it hung a second sword, shorter, a backup blade. The Magus spoke quietly. A warrior carries more than one blade. Enkidu nodded slowly. Across the room, Kale had already lifted his new weapon. A heavy war blade built for power, thick metal guard, broad cutting edge. His armor matched it. Reinforced shoulder plates and layered chest protection, strong enough to withstand enormous blows. Now this, Kyle said proudly, feels right. Kesh's equipment rested beside his. A faster blade, longer reach, designed for speed and precision rather than brute force. Thalin and Dagan each received massive tower shields, reinforced with the same strange metal, along with heavy maces capable of crushing bone and armor alike. Soren and Rethin's gear was lighter. Twin daggers balanced perfectly for throwing or close combat. Their armor was nearly silent when they moved. Liara's armor was simple but strong, paired with a staff tipped with a mysterious metal that could serve equally well for defense or healing focus. Mira's gear mirrored hers but included a short blade at her side. Every warrior also received a sword. Backup blades, standard across the group. Celine looked around the room slowly. These are too good. The Magus shook his head. They are what you will need. Kyle swung his new sword once through the air. The blade hummed. I like them. The Magus looked at the Lantern 10. All of you. They turned toward him. You are no longer children. He gestured toward the open doors of the training shed. The forest will confirm this. Celine tightened her grip on the spear. When do we leave? The old man smiled faintly. Soon. Chapter 2. First test of the forged weapons. The Lantern 10 returned to the training ground carrying their new weapons and armor. For a moment, the group simply stood in the morning sunlight, studying the unfamiliar metal. It was darker than bronze, yet when the light struck it, the surface shimmered faintly with hints of blue and silver. None of them had ever seen anything like it. Celine lifted her spear and slowly turned it in her hands. Thin metal bands reinforced the dark ashwood shaft, and along those bands, small symbols had been carved with precise care. Not scratches, not decoration. Symbols. Enkidu noticed the same markings running along the fuller of his sword. He tilted the blade slightly toward the light. Angular lines and curved shapes followed the center of the steel. Runes. He ran a finger lightly along one of them. Nova drifted beside him. These appear intentional. Runes? Enkidu murmured. Across the yard, Soren lifted one of his new daggers. Anyone else seeing this? Rathan leaned closer to inspect it. Yes. Kyle held his heavy war blade up in front of his face. If they make the sword stronger, I approve. Celine glanced toward the Magus. May we test them? The old man gave a single nod. Briefly. That was all the permission they needed. The Lantern 10 spread out across the training field out of pure habit. Years of practice meant each of them moved naturally toward familiar partners. Celine stepped toward Enkidu. Ready? He nodded. Across the yard, Kyle squared up against Kesh with a grin that suggested trouble. The scouts circled lightly, daggers already moving through practice motions. Thalen and Dagan raised their shields. Celine struck first. Her spear flashed forward with controlled speed. Enkidu lifted his blade. Steel met steel. The impact rang sharply across the training yard. Both fighters paused for half a breath. No splintering wood, no cracks, just clean metal. Celine smiled slightly. Better. Across the yard, Kyle swung hard at Kesh. Their blades collided with a loud clang that echoed across the field. Kyle blinked once. That didn't break. Kesh smirked. Good. The scouts moved faster, daggers flashing as they tested speed and balance. The blades moved smoothly through the air, perfectly balanced. Thalen slammed his shield forward against Dagan's. The metal rang like a bell. Dagan laughed. Much stronger. Liara tapped her staff lightly against Mira's. The weapon barely vibrated. Solid, she said quietly. For several more moments, the Lantern 10 exchanged light strikes and controlled blows. Every weapon held. Every strike rang clean. Finally, the Magus raised his hand. Enough! The Lantern 10 slowed immediately and lowered their weapons. They gathered around him as he studied the blades one last time. How do they feel? Good, Celine said. Balanced, Soren added. Unbreakable, Kyle declared proudly. The Magus allowed himself a small smile. Good. His gaze moved across the group. Bring your weapons. He gestured toward the shade of the cedar tree at the edge of the training yard. We have lessons. Kel sighed quietly. I knew there would be lessons. Celine nudged him with the spear shaft. Move. The Lantern 10 followed the Magus toward the tree, carrying their new weapons as the morning sun climbed higher over Nuridu Valley. The cedar tree at the edge of the training grounds had stood longer than anyone in the village could remember. Its thick trunk cast a wide shadow across the packed earth, and the stone benches beneath its branches had been worn smooth by years of use. Hunters often gathered there before patrols or long journeys. Today, the Lantern 10 filled the benches while the Magus knelt beside the ground in front of them. He brushed aside loose dust with one hand. Watch! Using a small stick, he began drawing in the soil. First, he traced a wide circle. This, he said calmly, is Nuridu Valley. Inside the circle, he placed a small mark. The village. Several of the Lantern 10 leaned forward to watch. The Magus continued drawing. Around the village, he added a broad ring. The forest! Then another beyond it, and another. 3 rings in total. Celine studied the drawing carefully. The layers? The Magus nodded. Yes. He tapped the first ring. This is the outer forest. Kyle leaned forward. That's where we've been training. Yes. The Magus moved the stick to the second ring. This is the mid-forest. Then to the third. The deep forest. The lantern. 10 watched silently as he finished the drawing. The deeper the forest, the Magus continued, the stronger the creatures that live there. Rethan crossed his arms. We've seen most of the outer creatures. The Magus looked up at him. You have seen some. Using the stick again, he marked several small symbols across the first ring. Ash wolves. Several of the group nodded. Thorn crawlers. Liara made a face. I remember those. The Magus continued marking the ring. Ironback boars. Kyle grinned slightly. Those fight back. The old man gave a small nod. They are meant to. He tapped the first ring again. These creatures belong to the outer forest. Then he pointed to the second ring. The mid-forest contains stronger predators. What kind? Mira asked. The Magus drew a rough shape. Pack hunters. Another. Ambush predators. Then another. Creatures that hunt alone. He looked up. You will learn their names when the time comes. Kyle folded his arms. So everything out there wants to kill us. The Magus met his gaze calmly. Yes. Kyle nodded. Good to know. The old man continued. He tapped the third ring. The deep forest. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Very few hunters travel there. The Lantern 10 exchanged glances. Celine watched the drawing closely. Because of the monsters? Yes. He added several large marks within the deepest ring. The creatures there are older. The word lingered in the air. Older, stronger, more dangerous. The Magus then began drawing something new. Tall shapes, stone structures. He marked several of them across the rings. These stand within the forest. Enkidu recognized the shape immediately. The pillars. The Magus nodded. Ancient structures. Kyle leaned forward. What do they do? The old man studied the drawing for a moment before answering. They open paths. Paths to where? Kesh asked. The Magus looked up. Other places. The answer hung quietly beneath the branches of the cedar. Celine studied the pillars drawn in the dirt. How many are there? In the valley. The Magus pointed with the stick. One within the outer forest. Another mark appeared in the second ring. One within the mid-forest. Then he marked the deepest ring, and one within the deep forest. Thalen leaned forward slightly. You've seen them. Yes. Gone through them? The Magus gave a small smile. No. The answer surprised several of them. Soren tilted his head. Why not? Because pillars are rarely unguarded. The Magus drew another symbol beside one of the pillars, larger, jagged. Guardians? Dagon spoke first. Monsters? Yes. Kale leaned forward eagerly. Big monsters? The old man nodded once. Yes. Rethan studied the drawing. Have you seen them? The Magus tapped the pillar in the first ring. The outer forest guardian has been encountered. Several of the Lantern 10 straightened slightly. Celine spoke calmly. What is it? The Magus erased the drawing slowly with his hand. Something you will meet when the time is right. Kyle frowned. That's not helpful. The Magus ignored the comment. The deeper pillars remain uncertain. He gestured toward the rings. No one who has seen those guardians has returned to describe them. Silence settled briefly over the group. The forest suddenly felt larger, older. Celine finally spoke. So the forest is layered? Yes. Each layer stronger? Yes. And pillars exist in each layer? Yes. The Magus stood slowly and brushed the dust from his hands. You will learn the outer forest first. His eyes moved across the Lantern 10. All of it. Kyle leaned back slightly. How long? The Magus looked toward the distant tree line beyond the village wall. A week. Several of them smiled. A week in the forest was not frightening. It was exciting. Selene stood. When do we leave? The Magus looked at the sky for a moment. Soon. He turned toward the forest. The valley has protected you since childhood. Then he looked back at them. Now the forest will begin teaching you. The Magus had just finished brushing the forest map from the ground when Soren lifted one of his daggers again. The blade caught the light beneath the cedar branches. Thin markings ran along the steel. He turned it slightly. These. Several of the others lifted their own weapons. The same symbols appeared on every blade, every shield, every spearhead. Even Liara's staff bore a narrow band of the strange metal carved with the same angular shapes. Selene studied the markings along her spear. They aren't decoration. No, the Magus said calmly. They are not. Enkidu held his sword in front of him again. Now that he looked closely, the runes were easier to see. They ran along the fuller of the blade in evenly spaced patterns. Not random. Deliberate. Nova drifted closer beside him. These symbols appear to repeat. They do, the Magus said. The Lantern 10 looked up at him. The old man stepped forward and gently turned Enkidu's blade so the group could see it clearly. These are runes. Cal squinted at the sword. Do they do something? The Magus gave him a faint smile. Yes. What? Help. Kyle blinked. That's not very specific. The Magus released the blade. You do not yet need to understand them fully. Selene looked back down at her spear. But they matter. Yes. The old man knelt once more and drew a small symbol in the dirt. It looked similar to the ones carved into their weapons. Runes are older than the village. He paused. Older than the forest pass. The Lantern 10 leaned slightly closer. Long ago, the Magus continued, people learned that certain symbols carry power when placed correctly. Kesh frowned slightly. Magic? The old man tilted his head. Understanding. Kyle folded his arms. That sounds like magic. The Magus ignored the comment. These runes strengthen the metal. He gestured toward their weapons. They help the blades hold their edge. He tapped Dagon's shield. They help armor endure heavy blows. Then he stood again. But the runes on your weapons are only the beginning. Soren glanced down at his dagger. There are more. Many more. Selene asked the next question. Will we learn them? The Magus nodded. Yes, but not today. Several of the Lantern 10 sighed. Kyle exaggerated his disappointment. More lessons later. The old man smiled faintly. Many more. He looked across the group carefully. Runes are tools. His voice grew slightly firmer. And like all tools, they must be understood before they are trusted. Enkidu studied the symbols on his sword again. They seemed almost alive in the morning light. Quiet, ancient, waiting. The Magus turned toward the village. Enough lessons for now. Selene stood. So we prepare. The old man nodded. Yes. He looked once more toward the forest line beyond the village wall. The outer forest waits. Chapter 2. Evening in Nuridu. By the time the Magus finished the last of his lessons, the sun had already begun sinking behind the western ridge of the valley. The long shadows of the Veilward Mountains stretched across the fields, and the warmth of the day faded into the cool breath of evening. The Lantern Ten walked back toward the village together. For once they were quiet. It had been a long day. New weapons, lessons about the forest, talk of pillars and guardians, runes carved into blades they did not yet understand. Each of them carried the weight of new thoughts. Kel finally broke the silence. The one inside my head says the sword is acceptable. Several of them looked over at him. Kesh laughed. Acceptable? That's the word. Kale shrugged. Not amazing, not legendary, just acceptable. Celine shook her head. That sounds exactly like you. They reached the wash trough beside the longhouse where cold river water flowed through a carved stone basin. One by one, they rinsed dust and sweat from their hands and faces. Thalen lifted a full bucket and dumped it over his head. Water splashed across the ground. Doggin stepped back quickly. A warning would be nice. Too late? Nearby, Enkidu washed his hands while Nova hovered quietly beside him. You are all thinking, she said. That obvious? Yes. Across the trough, Mira leaned against the stone edge. The voice in my head hasn't stopped asking questions all afternoon. Liara looked over. What kind of questions? Everything. Mira shrugged. What pillars do? Why the runes feel warm? Why the forest feels different? Celine wiped water from her face. The one with me has been quiet. Soren glanced over. That's unusual. Celine nodded. It's listening. Rethan leaned against the trough beside them. The presence with me keeps repeating one word. Everyone looked at him. What word? Kesh asked. Rethan thought for a moment. Paths. Celine frowned slightly. Paths? That's what it keeps saying. He shrugged. Something about the pillars opening paths. For a moment, the group fell silent again. Kyle finally broke it. Well, the voice in my head just keeps commenting on the sword. Kesh laughed. That sounds right. They finished washing and walked toward the dining hall. Night had settled fully over Nooradu. Lanterns hung along the paths, casting warm golden light across the village streets, while villagers moved between homes in the dining hall for the evening meal. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the air. Kyle inhaled deeply. Oh, that smells good. Inside the hall, the great hearth burned bright. Dinner had already begun. Tonight's meal was hearty. Large clay bowls held thick venison stew simmered with root vegetables and herbs gathered from the valley fields. Fresh bread rested in woven baskets along the tables. Small wooden platters carried roasted river fish brushed with oil and crushed herbs. Liara filled a bowl of stew and took a piece of bread. Mira grabbed fish and bread. Thalen took 2 bowls of stew. Kale took everything. Selene noticed. You're going to eat all of that? Kyle nodded proudly. Yes. Kesh leaned toward him. The voice in your head probably told you to. Kale pointed with a spoon. It absolutely did. The Lantern Ten gathered around their usual table as the warmth of the hall settled around them. For a few minutes they simply ate. The day's lessons had left them hungry. Spoons scraped clay bowls. Bread disappeared quickly. Then Soren spoke again. The one with me noticed something earlier. Rathan glanced over. What? Soren tapped one of his daggers resting beside his bowl. It said the runes are sleeping. Several of them paused. Liara frowned slightly. Sleeping? That's how it described them. Celine glanced down at the spear leaning beside her chair. The one with me said the same thing. Enkidu raised an eyebrow. Nova drifted closer to the table. That is an interesting interpretation. Mira leaned forward. What does yours say? Enkidu shrugged slightly. Mostly that you all talk a lot. Kale grinned. I like that one. Nova tilted her head. I also observed that Kale's eating patterns suggest excessive food consumption. Kale froze mid-bite. That's rude! Laughter spread around the table. Liara took another spoonful of stew before speaking again. The presence with me said something strange, too. Celine looked over. What? Liara hesitated. It said the forest is watching. The table went quiet for a moment. Outside the hall, the wind rustled through the distant trees. Rethan leaned back slightly. The one with me said something similar. What? Mira asked. That the forest remembers. Kyle finished another bowl of stew and wiped his mouth. Well, the one with me said nothing about forests. Kesh smirked. What did it say? Cal lifted another piece of bread. It said the stew is good. Celine sighed. Of course it did. Laughter returned again as the Lantern 10 continued their meal, sharing the strange little things the quiet voices within them had whispered throughout the day. Tomorrow they would leave the village, and the forest would begin speaking for itself. The Lantern 10 left the dining hall together beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. Nuridu Valley had grown quiet for the evening. Lanterns burned along the paths between homes, their soft light flickering across wooden fences and sleeping livestock. The sounds of the village had faded into the peaceful rhythm of night. Somewhere beyond the fields, the Lantern River flowed steadily through the valley, its quiet current whispering against the stones. Kyle stretched as they walked. That was a good meal. Kesh laughed. You say that every night. Yes. And it's always true. Celine shook her head as they approached the longhouse. Try not to eat the entire forest tomorrow. No promises. They stepped inside the longhouse where the embers of the hearth still glowed faintly. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Boots were kicked aside. Weapons were leaned carefully against the wall beside each bedroll. Their new armor rested nearby where each of them could reach it quickly. Soren sat cross-legged beside his bedroll, inspecting one of his daggers again, studying the runes carved along its surface. They almost look different in the firelight, he murmured. Rethan leaned over to look. They don't change. Maybe not. But they feel like they could. Across the room, Thalen finished adjusting the straps of his armor before setting it carefully beside his shield. Tomorrow we find out how strong the forest really is. Dagan lay back on her bedroll. I'm more curious about the monsters. Liara rolled onto one elbow. You always are. Mira stretched her legs toward the hearth. I'm curious about the pillars. Celine sat beside her spear, polishing the blade with a small cloth. We're not going near them yet. Still curious. Kyle leaned back against one of the wooden support beams. I just want to see if something out there can actually break this sword. Kesh grinned. Oh, something can. That sounds promising. Laughter moved easily through the longhouse. For a while, the Lantern 10 talked about the forest, which creatures they hoped to see, which ones they hoped not to, what the Magus might be hiding about the deeper parts of the woods. Eventually, the conversation softened. One by one, they settled onto their bedrolls. The fire burned low. Outside, the night deepened. Celine was the last to lie down. She glanced once across the longhouse, making sure everyone was settled. Satisfied, she rested beside her spear. Soon, the only sound inside the building was the steady breathing of sleeping warriors. The dream came quietly. At first it felt like walking. The Lantern 10 stood together beneath towering trees. The forest around them was darker than the outer forest they knew. Older, the air carried the scent of deep earth and ancient stone. Ahead of them, something rose from the forest floor. A pillar, massive, stone-covered in the same runes carved into their weapons. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness. The pillar towered above them like the spine of the world itself. None of them spoke, yet somehow they knew they were all there, together. Then something called to them, not a voice, more like a pull, a presence beyond the pillar, ancient, waiting. The runes along the stone pulsed slowly as if breathing, and then something moved behind the pillar, a shape, tall, still, watching. The lantern 10 tried to see it clearly, but the shadow never stepped fully into the light. Still, a feeling spread through the dream. Cold, heavy, menacing. The presence behind the pillar did not feel like a guardian. It felt like something far older, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time. The runes on the pillar flared once. Then the dream faded. Outside the longhouse, the Magus stood beneath the night sky. The valley slept quietly behind him. Far beyond the trees, faint lights flickered deep in Des Forest. Pillars, ancient runes glowing in the darkness. The old wizard watched them calmly. A faint smile crossed his face. "So," he whispered softly, "you finally noticed them."